Hello, welcome back to my channel. I just thought whilst my thoughts were running wild on the idea, and it's kind of annoying. Like, I do feel like I have to explain that I think this way and that I can't really concisely think, but it's because I don't really have like a fixed point to reach for. Like, I don't know how it's being received. I don't really know what I'm going to say, and the more I try to plan stuff, it just ends up like being somehow like I need to make it perfect, and so I'm going to resist saying and doing it. Whereas, you just say stuff and it ends up far better. Like, literally everything that I did in my life on a whim, besides maybe some emotional interactions, it's always turned out for the best, just to express directly the feelings and thoughts and ideas. And so it's quite difficult when you're trying to make like a video and you actually do have things that you want to explore. But truth. So I guess I started out, I was raised by SFJs, ESFJ and ISFJ, and in a really, I guess, like a cultural backwater. And you couldn't really be any kind of person other than what was presented around you. Like, it's always a bit threatening to be slightly different. And SFJs, they have a focus on. Actually, there used to be one who lived in this room that I'm currently in an ISTJ, and I have a lot of respect for ISTJs. I really love ISTJs and INTJs, but he would always talk about common decency, and I guess that's like, I didn't know him, by the way, but my flatmate knew him, and he had this thing of common decency. And but then the more that you meet people who don't have common decency, you start thinking, well, some of us have to act as though there is common decency. Like, I do believe in having moral standards, and it does become more evident. But I did grow up with like immense moral standards. Not that I wasn't raised strictly at all, but there was very much, there's normal and there's not normal, and you're not normal, and you don't relate in a normal way. You don't. You're not a good person because you're eccentric. Like, these aren't, sometimes they were explicitly stated, most often in arguments, because I feel like ESFJs are kind of control freaks. Like, they do have many good aspects. I think this is generalizing as well. Like, INTPs are definitely control freaks too. And even if you don't think they are, even if we act like the most liberal person possible, but everybody has it. Like, everybody has some controlling tendency somewhere inside of them. That's just people. So I don't really think that expressing ESFJ as being like that is the way to say it. But I think, yeah, there was definitely, like, I would incite a lot of anger out of the ESFJ, and because I can be a bitch as well. But I was a teenager, I was a child, I was very much, not really knowing how the world worked or how to behave, and desperately trying to conform in some ways and desperately trying to express myself in others, and it was just a mess. And I moved out quite young. I'm very glad that I did, because, not to say that they weren't there supporting me in the background, but I had to do a lot for myself eventually, not in early life, but later on, because it was, I don't know, like, I had to find my own way. And you start, I think I had like an existential crisis aged, definitely, I definitely think like 15, 16 was like a big crisis point that I resisted talking about, because I feel like I don't really know how to. And also, I'm worried that it sounds stupid, because it's not like, you could obviously go through worse. I didn't really go through anything, but then I did go through a lot as well, like, for myself, like, in a subjective way. Like, that's introverted feeling, which I don't really have, is struggling to, or do I have it? Do I have too much of it? I do feel like I'm a bit too accusatory about things sometimes. But anyway, like, there was like a breakdown of truth. Like, I didn't believe in truth anymore. There's no truth. It's, become like, maybe not necessarily like a philosophical perspectivist, but then maybe also, I don't know. And I felt like a bit like Descartes. Like, I talk about Descartes in a quite a flippant way, because that sounds really unphilosophical to fixate on just one philosopher who's, creates modern philosophy and is like a basic reading text. And in fact, when I knew nothing about philosophy, one of my friends who studied philosophy was like, you should read Descartes. So I read Descartes. I'd already been Descartes at that point. I had already broken down to nothing else exists but me and God, and everything else is fake. I'd already had like that moment at age 16, and I was extremely depressed, I think. But not because of that. That sounds really... See, it's very hard to express these things sincerely and not, and to know how to refer to things. And it makes it sound like I've been through some great trauma, and it wasn't that. It's more like a process of thoughts, which, a process of experience, but a set of experiences which I'm not really sure how to explain. But I stopped believing in truth, but then I had this huge conflict of how do I align the subjective with the objective? How do I justify who I am and how I've come to be a personality that exists in the way that it does, with all its abrasiveness, with all its like terrible aspects, with all its like fantasies? Like, because I was a maladaptive daydreamer, as I've said in a previous video, and I was lost in fantasy and I couldn't deal with the real world. And which I'm not like that anymore, but I definitely was like that. And to an extent, yeah, like real life is overwhelming, but I don't live in fantasies. And I never really like seriously lived in fantasies. Like I did encounter later on, I would date other INTPs and they lived in fantasy world and had like ideal attachments, and obviously like, anything real was not ever going to come up to that standard, and they were really antisocial, and I'm actually very socially outgoing a lot of the time, so I don't really have that. Although I did have a period of being withdrawn, but it never really like reached the point of self-delusion. I've always been extremely self-aware. But I struggled to like line up my own fantasies and my own feelings and how real my fantasies seemed with like what was going on in the outside world and how easy my life actually was. But then it seemed so hard, and I was like, what is subjective? What is objective? How can I build like an interface between these things? And conservative politics actually seemed to be the way for a while. And I would still say I'm fundamentally a conservative. That's not only socially where I've ended up, but that is also just, yeah, I don't know, like as a party, I think it's a case of socially I ended up there. Also you only really have Labour or Conservatives, everything else is completely pointless, and the people involved in Labour are just totally different to the people involved in the Conservatives, and I could not, like, even though in many ways some of my ideas aren't like cut and paste conservatism, I'm probably a conservative, but that seemed a way of like dealing with subjective and objective, and in many ways, even people who would say like they're total philosophical subjectivists, they have conservative ideals as a way, again, of interfacing and of keeping... It's actually the best way of preserving the subjective self, because that's Christian also, the person, the respect for the individual, and I would probably like to elaborate on this, but anyway, I went through this phase of like there's no truth, everything is metaphor over metaphor and metaphor, and you just have to dance amongst the metaphors, and I was really interested in, I guess, like a distaste for rationality, to put it in the most simple way, because I'm aware I'm not giving a philosophy lecture and I don't really know how to explain it because I haven't thought about how I'm going to explain it, so to save time, like I was really like anti-rationalist, and really, and it's also weird because I did have like a huge love of the romantic poets and romantic literature, and I would still say very much my imagination is 18th and 19th century London. Also, I guess I love the 16th and 17th century generally in Europe. I really love history. But I don't really know why am I saying this again. It's like the video is going over time, but then you actually get to a point of realizing that moral values. Like, there has to be a subjective, there has to be creativity, there has to be the fact everything is like fundamentally flawed and all over the place and imperfect, and eccentricity has to be allowed. But then people who don't believe in truth and don't believe in moral values and like upholding those are very difficult people to deal with, and your life becomes, I think, messy and depressing, and it would involve you showing a lack of respect to the people around you because you are expected to uphold yourself so that you can uphold other people, or you're expected to at least uphold other people, not in a people-pleasing way, but in a way where it's coming from yourself, and that you are able to be there as a person, relating with them and supporting them, and having a standard. So you do what you say you're going to do. You try to express things in the most clear way, because I think it's not quite first thought, best thought. Which, whose writing process was that? I kind of want to say it was Kerouac, maybe it was Hemingway. I don't know. It was like of that era. Not necessarily first thought, best thought, but then like the most direct and truthful that you are, the less problems you also have of OCD, which is like a weird systematic thing of trying to cope with fear and unclear focuses. Like, you're not really focusing on people around you or your own bodily and emotional state. You're sort of abstracting to put a fence around your fears and to systematize and deal with it. And that's like really a huge impediment to socializing. Like, I had terrible OCD, like blushing OCD, like my face would turn pink, I would sweat, I would get all these weird triggers about stuff. I would get like muscle twinges from like the amount of stress that socializing or being around people who I respected would put me into, and it was really like embarrassing because you blush and then people think you think certain things that you don't think, and it's just but yeah, so like truth and like trying to be honest and trying to show up and trying to do what is morally best, also so that you can deal with yourself. Like, I think a lot of so-called mental illness, which I do not believe in the concept of mental illness. I believe there's great suffering, but I don't believe that it's an illness, and I believe you can become very ill, you can be extremely ill, but in itself it's not an illness that afflicts you. It's just another conceptual framework to put around like the state that you have ended up in, and sometimes a lot of that comes from not being morally upright as a person. Like, maybe it is a state of sin. Not to say I don't have sympathy. I have huge sympathy, and I'm not the most, I'm not exactly a normal person, but I don't think there is any such thing as a normal person. I think the normal person is someone who is resisting depth or hasn't got like the mind that flies in that way, but then isn't, there's, I wouldn't say it's individuating that somebody becomes not normal, but I think I don't know, it's just a case of depth, maybe. But then there are some really like normal and boring people, right? And then there are great eccentrics. And I think even the people who have like the most respect for the person as the individual will say that there is definitely a clear line at which somebody becomes like a remarkably odd personality. I'm definitely a remarkably odd personality. I'm fine with that, I don't care. You just have to deal with it at some point, right? But I think, that sounds really egotistical. I don't even think in those ways. Like I've said, I've had a huge problem with like, dealing with subjective and objective for a very long time. Tormenting myself. I would get like dizzy with thought. I would nearly collapse under the weight of my own thoughts. It was really, like, I could make myself sick from thinking and systematizing and trying to understand stuff or trying to create systems where there weren't any, and just really, I don't know. Where am I going with this? Anyway, yeah, I realised like truth is actually really important, and communicating emotively and sometimes impulsively and just being a human being that can relate with other people is really important, and that's a certain type of truth as well. But I think, yeah, if you don't do bad things in terms of, you see sometimes people who live amongst all kinds of drama, and you just think, how can you live with yourself amongst that? And they're clearly not living with themselves. And yeah, I don't know, there is something to be said for like a platonic worldview, and I have huge respect for my friends who are living accordingly to that. Like I do know a lot of people like that, friends who, when you compare them with people who fall outside of those who respect moral truth, I don't really know how to express it. Like they're not as good people. You just can't trust them. They don't show up. They don't try. And yet everybody has. There's not, just because if you say suddenly, oh, I believe in truth, that doesn't make you suddenly a good person. And I don't, but I think it's. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of like I've ended up from this amoral thing into believing in trying to be a more somebody who believes in common decency. Or do I don't know, because that doesn't mean being weak. Like I kind of want to say, like I said in my previous video, that I mentioned, like, in a throwaway way, I would like to explore this because I do really believe in it. I'm an elitist. I'm a huge elitist, and I know the consequences of not being an elitist, and I know that it's disrespect for other people and disrespect for yourself. And it's like an old phrase, which I got this from the Orthodox Church actually, but I feel like this is something people say when they're like explaining Christianity for beginners or people who don't know who Jesus is. Like Jesus is not like a meek, soft person. Like Jesus can be like really horrible and critical. And is he an elitist? Not in maybe not in the way you think, but I think being able to like draw boundaries and say what you think and hold yourself as who you are and not, because people pleasing is certainly a horrible weakness, and maybe you'd end up there if you can't draw boundaries and rest within yourself in some way and understand the line between yourself and others and where you are actually a lot better than them. Because elitism it's dangerous not to respect it, I think. And I will end there.